Welcome back. So starting out the second half of the week, I've got my vacuum system set up here with a little test line that I created so I can hook up to the little AN3 fittings that we have there. And what I'm doing here is I've got my feed line there on the input that comes from the reservoir, and I've blocked off the outlet there that goes to the brake caliper, and I'm just testing the integrity of the braking system inside the cabin. And I actually ended up finding one leak in there. There was one fitting I didn't tighten up all the way when I was doing everything. But as you can see here, now that I've got that sorted out, I can pull a vacuum on there. I'm pulling 15 inches and it holds nicely. So that was good, and the lines going out from there out to the brake calipers were also good. And I had fixed the lines there that were going to the reservoirs. They were a bit loose on the fittings, and so everything was good there. So the next thing to do was just get this little cap thing sorted out. I actually ended up changing out that cork little gasket that Devon created just for this bit of what is actually a bit of shrink wrap. So the aim was to pull a vacuum on the whole brake system and then allow the fluid to feed in from down at the calipers, thinking that that may be the best way to eliminate any air in the system. And it worked actually fairly well, but I still ended up with some air in the system, and so it took some traditional just regular pumping on the brakes and stuff to get that out. But as you can see here, I'm holding 15 inches again, and then what I do down here, I've got my caliper down there there's the little feed line in there. So the next thing to do is put the brake fluid on there and allow it to sort of feed in. And meanwhile, Devon's mixing up some high sol there so Jeff can bond in the ribs into the other side elevator skin, the upper skin, and that would be the last of the elevators there that need to get done. Obviously the lower side skins will have to happen, but you can see he's got everything sort of lined up there and bolted on to the hangers and the hinges, and just bonded those ribs in there, so that's all good. And the next step now is to get things sorted out with the linkages, and then ultimately be able to close out the elevator and the foreplane and have that as a done job. So this is the little bleeder valve that goes in the brake caliper there, and it has a little hole through it that allows you to sort of push air or fluid or whatever through it. But the problem with it is once you loosen it off, air can come in around the thread. So what I've done there is I've just put a little bit of gasket sealer around there in an attempt to create like a more tight sort of seal around the threads, and then have it work kind of as a valve but not leak around the threads. And this way I can connect the tube that feeds into the brake fluid and have it pull a vacuum and pull fluid through the whole system, and hopefully not have any air remaining in the system. But unfortunately, just because of the geometry of everything, there was a couple of places, and I'm just guesstimating, but there was a couple of places, probably in the master cylinder or maybe in the brake caliper there, where air was still sort of trapped in there. And there's really only one way that I know to get it out there, and that's basically just to do your standard, pump on the brakes, a ton of times, and then push some fluid through there to get any air out, and then block it off and pump on them again, and so on and so on. And so ultimately that's what I ended up having to do. But this was actually a really quick way to get a bunch of fluid into the system without doing a lot of work. Once you pulled some vacuum on there, it basically filled up the system pretty well. As you can see here, it didn't take very long, and I ended up putting about a quarter of a bottle in there, and that's I think that's a pint bottle, so a quarter of a pint in one side there, and then had to go through the process just pumping the brakes and such, and back and forth. So it took a little while to get it sorted out, and I'm sure there's a better way, but just the orientation of the cylinders, the master cylinders, you're basically pulling fluid in from, I believe, the top down to the bottom. So there's definitely a possibility of air remaining in the system there. The only way to make sure that it wouldn't be that everything was basically moving uphill, and that's just not the case. So anyway, there's the system there, just set up with 15 inches of vacuum on there, and just waiting for it to come out the other side. So pretty neat little system there. So I picked up this little pump there, or vacuum pump thing, from our good old friends at Harbour Freight, and it's doing a pretty good job. Actually used it for a couple other things already now, so ended up using it on the engine to help with just making sure we had good oil through the system. And you could probably quite easy, and in fact I did actually use it to try and get the engine coolant sort of bled through the system as well, so it's come in handy. Anyway, as you can see, right about here is where it's finally just coming through, and it just pulls through and it goes into that that little container there, so it doesn't actually get sort of drawn into the vacuum pump gun itself. And I allowed it about a half of that container to pull through, in an effort to try and get rid of as much air as I could in the system. And as I said, it worked okay, but still had to go through the manual process of pumping on the brakes and such. But anyway, got that all done, and brakes are all sorted out now, and with the handbrake hookup that I had set up before for locking it, we do have some brakes on the aircraft now, so that's good. So there's the first reservoir there, just with a bit of paper towel around there, and actually it turns out it wasn't overfilling because of the way I had the thing set up. So I just topped it up a little bit more and put the cap on there, and the cap has a rubber seal in it with a little air breather to allow it to sort of pull into there as the fluid goes down. Anyway, so that's that job out of the way, and here's Jeff prepping now to put the skin on the winglet there, the outer skin on the winglet of each of the wings. And you can see he's got the high sole there on the spar and on the spar cap, and he's just doing it on the leading edge there now. So it's a bit of a milestone being able to close these out. I'm excited to see that, and it won't be long and there'll be nothing left to do on these wings, so that's good. And after finishing both sides of the brakes there, I've mounted the reservoir back up against the forward bulkhead there, as you can see, and it kind of, they sit sort of tucked underneath that lip there, and if you ever needed to top them up, you can just unbolt it off of there. And as you can see, I've got brake pressure there now. It is possible to still push it in a little ways. It takes a bit of effort. So on to the next job, and this is the outcome there of Jeff bonding those ribs in there for the elevator for that right hand side. So that's just all curing up now, and you'll be able to move on to the next phase of that one. And for people reading the comments on these videos on YouTube, I did mention there the other day that, or somebody actually gave me a link to this ruggedized Arduino, and so I ended up buying that because it can run down to like minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, I think, or Celsius, which I think is almost the same. And it has a couple of other things that can handle voltages better and that sort of stuff, so I can run it off at 12 volts. So anyway, I'm replacing that one out, and while that's going on, here's Jeff who's got the high sole all done, all laid out there on this other wing in order to put the winglet skin there on that one, and that'll be the last of the closeouts for the wings. And there's the other one with the skin on there now, and a bit of various bits of wood there holding it clamped into place so it stays nice and snug as it cures up. So there was a bit of a difference on this new Arduino board, this ruggedized one with the connector there. You see it's using an old school, much larger style USB connector. So I made a hole a bit larger there in the bottom of the case, so I could just basically plug that fitting in there without having to open up the case at all. And that way I can flash the code on there when I want to make changes. And so here's that winglet there. Again, the other one all bonded on and clamped in place so it can set up. So the next thing to do on these ones is basically do a quick layup over where the seams are there, and then those guys can come out of their jigs. And given that I'm now working on fluids for the aircraft, I thought I'd top up the coolant system, because that needed to be topped up after we did a bunch of work on it. So you see, got my little vacuum pump there going again, and I'm actually pulling vacuum from this breather line that goes into the top of the engine, and as you can see, it's pulling that fluid there all the way through the system. So it actually worked pretty good, and as you can see, it's come all the way around. And there's two different sort of pathways inside of this engine, and so you've got to sort of bleed one of them and then bleed the other one a little bit separately. So and even then, after the engine's been running for a little bit and the thermostat's open up, you still need to put more coolant in it to top it up. And as I just mentioned earlier there, what was left on the wings now was just to put a little layup over the seams there, just to sort of close those out nicely. And that's what Jeff and Devon are doing here. Just a little bit of carbon fibre over there and some peel ply over the top, and that closes out the seam on the leading edge. So both of those get done all the way down around the winglets as well. And moving along with the fluids, the next thing to do was top up the oil, or at least refill the oil, because I had drained the whole system there when I had hooked up the new return lines for the redrive. So you can see I've got my little tablet there, laptop thing set up, and if you see down the bottom there, you've got the two red indicator lights on. The one on the right hand side is the oil level low switch, and so I'm going to keep an eye on that one just to sort of see how many quarts it takes before that thing turns off. So then you'll know how many quarts you have left when that thing comes on. So putting this is a 5-quart container in there, and generally the engine takes 8 quarts, but because we have the redrive in there and extra plumbing and stuff associated with that, that definitely needs probably another quart of oil for that, and also to the governor that uses some extra oil as well. So as you can see, I'm filling it up there, and if you just keep an eye there on that the two red lights there on the bottom of the screen, or two red sort of labels on the bottom of the screen, you're going to see one of them eventually go off there, the one on the right hand side. And as I said, that's the oil level low. So it's pretty neat actually to be able to have the Motec software running on the tablet here on the Wi-Fi that I've got in the system, and be able to see all the engine parameters and walk around the ship completely untethered and be able to see what's going on. I mean, that's pretty high tech. I mean, you don't have that in your car. Even if you have one of those ODB readers, you still have to be plugged in to the port. And with this, you don't have to be. You're just basically completely wireless. In fact, you can walk quite a ways, or you can actually run this over the internet. So, and that's a possibility for us to be able to do. I think I have to check on that, or at least you'll be able to use a remote control application if you wanted to see what's going on there. You can see that light's gone off there now, or that label's gone off. So still got to put a little bit more oil in there, probably another couple quarts in there before it's all good. And the dipstick, and I've shown this ages ago, it's real tricky to get to, and then Audi should have put it in a better place, knowing full well that we were going to put their engine on our aircraft, because it's really in a pain of a place to get into, sort of underneath the radiator a little bit. And I can get in there and grab it and stuff, but and this is why I put that oil level sensor in there, or switch in there, because this way you won't have to check the oil every time that you go. If you ever see the oil low light come on, you'll know that it's time to put more oil in there. Like if you see it on in any duration of your flight, you'll know that it's getting a little bit low. I need to top it up when I get out, and or before my next flight. So it's a bit hard to top it up while you're flying. So although that's possibly something you could set up if you really were worried about your engine. But again, keep in mind this is an auto engine. It's not like an aviation engine. It's not designed to burn oil. It doesn't use, hardly any oil compared to an aviation engine that basically sort of is designed to drink some oil. And so you have to keep topping up. So this one here, just like any car, when was the last time you added oil to your fairly new engine in between oil changes on your car? You just don't. So this is basically the same thing. So having the dipstick in a very awkward place, it's a downer, but it's not the end of the world because of this engine. So anyway, got the oil topped up in there, and time to move on to the next job. So I showed you a little while back, well, not that far back, this little linear actuator that we have for opening and closing the outlet sort of cowling vent there on the bottom of the cowling. And actually we were going to have the inlet scoop on the roof opening and closing, but we've decided just sort of at the last minute just to sort of lock that in place for now. A little bit concerned about whether or not it would be strong enough or hold on strong enough with the hinges that we had set up and the mounting. And given that we added the cowling outlet sort of as an afterthought, it's probably just as well that we can just control that one and just leave the scoop open, and later on we can always hook on an actuator onto the inlet scoop. So what I'm doing here is I'm using the wires that were pre-done already for this switch on the overhead panel there in the cabin for opening and closing the intake scoop. Basically repurposing those wires to allow us to basically open and close this cowling vent. And so I'm just putting one of these Deutsch connectors on those wires that come from the cabin, and then ultimately put the matching connector on the wires that come from the cowling actuator. And initially it'll just be manual control, and it's momentary push button, so you can just a little bit until it gets to the maximum. And ultimately later on, if we want to, it's probably easy enough to just control that using the ECU. But for now, as you can see here, I'm just basically putting that connector on the actuator, and we'll just manually control it until we figure out whether it's better just to control it with the ECU. And in that case, it's just a matter of just unplugging that connector and just plugging it into the ECU and just setting up the parameters in the ECU to control it. I'm not sure exactly how you do it, but I'm sure it's possible. And on that cowling vent, that little tab that we Devon sort of bonded in place to hook up the actuator to, my geometry, which was just eyeball geometry, I didn't actually do it very well in CAD or anything, was slightly off. That's why I use SolidWorks, so I don't make mistakes like that. But anyway, so I had to make a little extension to that tab and then pick out where the hole was going to be. And also here we had to move the hole on this bracket further back and further up a little bit. And so after doing that, it works beautifully. So a little bit of trial and error there, but that's, again, prototype. And Jeff here is in the process of just cleaning up the leading edges of the ailerons there, where he had to sort of do a nice little sort of lay up over the seam there, and he's smoothing that all out. And as you can see, the wings are out of the jigs, and the jigs have been disassembled, and the shop looks like crazy, all this room. And we've moved the fuselage in preparation for backing it up to the door and running the engine. So what a difference the shop feels like now. There's still a bunch of stuff there, but boy, there's a lot more room. And here we've actually got the wing and the aileron and rudder on the scale, and as you can see in the bottom corner, 169 pounds, not bad. A little bit heavy, but it's lighter than what we thought it was going to be, at least what I thought it was going to be, so that's a plus. And yes, we'll share the rest of the weight data later on, but for right now we're sort of keeping that under our hat. Anyway, here is the fuselage backed up to the door, and I've got some straps on there and some chocks and things like that. Not that we're going to run the engine hard, but I do want to run the engine because it's time to find out whether or not our new design for the redrive was successful. So here I'm getting ready to get it started for the first time in a little while. The last time it ran was when we got the engine on there and Dan was still with us. So it's been a little while. And I've had the battery and stuff on the charger, but unfortunately after turning it over a bunch of times because I wanted to bring the oil pressure up, I pretty much flattened the little battery that we have. And so when it came time now to try and start it, it didn't have a lot. And of course, you know, diesel engine, a high compression engine, takes a little bit to get it going. And as I said, we're running it without any fuel going into it just to get the oil pressure to come up had taken the battery down. But here you go. This is what it sounds like when you're trying to start it with a flat battery. Throttle is at idle. So I asked the guys to pull the battery from the test stand, which is a much larger unit, but unfortunately that one hadn't been charged up in forever either, so that one didn't have too much juice to provide. So I thought about it for a few minutes and decided to actually just pull my car in to the back of the shop. So we had to move a few barrels and stuff that were blocking the door because we hadn't had anything going in and out the big door for a while because it's been cold and raining a lot. So anyway, opened up the back door and went around, got my car and brought my car inside and jumped it straight off my car, and that ended up giving us plenty of juice to fire it up. So here we have one Audi giving the other one a helping hand. Please excuse the shaky camera. I forgot to remind Devin just to hold my phone fairly still when he's recording. Anyway, so this is the first time that we've run the engine with the new redrive on there, and obviously we've got the old prop on there, the 4-blader, and I was, you know, super nervous because, you know, the last time we ran the old redrive and we had oil in there, it was a bit of a mess, and you know, ended in, I wouldn't say tears, but I wasn't very happy. And you know, that was almost a year ago, I think, getting close to it. So anyway, needless to say, nervous about this one, and anyway, ran it and didn't have any problems with it. It wasn't leaking oil, it didn't seize up. We haven't had a chance to really get the governor to push any high pressure oil through there to see if it would cycle the prop. I've got the pressure gauge on there, but we didn't get it to register anything other than 0 right now, which is what it's supposed to register. And I believe I need to talk to Martin again over at MT, but I believe we need to take the engine up to about 2400 RPM before the governor will kick in, and I only took it to about 1700 RPM on this little run. Just wasn't enough. But ultimately everything looked good, and you know, we brought the engine up to about 145 degrees, just sort of warming it up. And when we shut it down, the redrive had about the same temperature as the oil. And just after we shut it down, just a little bit after we shut it down, a little bit of oil came trickling out the back there, where the oil seal is around the shaft. And I think it's because where that long O-ring seal is, I didn't put enough sealer around where it meets up with the rubber oil ring that goes around the prop shaft. And I think when the engine shuts down, it actually creates a bit of a high pressure setup inside the redrive there, because it just sort of trickled out just for a little bit and then it stopped. And it was kind of like maybe tears of joy or something, little black tears of joy. coming out the redrive. But anyway, it didn't seize up, and it was working, and it's turning, and didn't get too hot or anything like that. So the next step, and it was probably going to happen when we take this up to the airport, is to run it up to higher RPM, and with the new prop on it, and then hopefully the governor cycles and does what it's supposed to do. So anyway, that's a big milestone and a lot of weight off my shoulders, and I think we're going to be good with this new redrive. So at the end of the day on Friday, there's my car sitting in there, and it was time to go home and relax over the weekend for a little bit, and before moving on to the last sort of step next week, which is just a bunch of little closeout projects and stuff, and even a little bit more work on the doors just to finish off. So that's our update for this week, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks again for watching, and tune in again on Tuesday and see what we've got to offer.